Thank you for joining us in the first installment of the Allyship, a Lifestyle series hosted by Region 1 of the SNMA. We hope this space allows us to exchange ideas and practice essential skills in being effective allies in the fight for racial justice alongside our Black peers, faculty members, and community members. This session was presented by Dr. Luis Manriquez on the topic of effective community engagement. Effective community engagement amplifies the voices of those residing in our communities so that they can have a say in the decisions that affect their daily lives, their communities, and their families. We hope that you will be able to attend this session and subsequent sessions live or here on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. So it is my distinct privilege tonight to introduce you all to our speaker this evening, Dr. Luis Manriquez. Dr. Manriquez is a practicing family physician at Bobby Health, an outreach clinic oriented at working with underserved populations, located at the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine at Washington State University. He's also an assistant clinical professor at SFCOM, where he leads health equity development efforts in the Department of Academic and Community Partnerships. However, his contributions to health equity began far earlier than his professional medical career. As a medical student at the University of Washington School of Medicine Spokane site, he founded the Health Equity Circle, which is an interprofessional group of students, empowering them to tackle public health issues with community partners. Today, he continues to work with the Health Equity Circle as a co-director. Collectively, the Health Equity Circle has worked with community partners to increase funding for affordable housing by $67 million, to support a $327 million bond for early childhood education programs, to protect medical interpretive services from budget cuts and legislation requiring workers to have access to sick and safe leave at their jobs. I'm so honored to host your talk tonight, and I'm so excited for you to teach us about effective community engagement. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Manriquez.
Thank you. Happy to be with you all tonight. So, in 20 minutes, I was trying to, and with discussion to follow, I was trying to think about the best way to do this session. Sorry, Luis Manriquez, I use he, him pronouns. I'm a family physician. So what I was going to do is pull a couple of different concepts out from community organizing and compare and contrast and try to connect those to this concept of allyship, which comes from a different historical place, and then hopefully let you all try to localize those to your own context and culture and figure out what lessons you can draw in the small groups. So it will be a little bit high level, and if you're looking for specific examples, it's very difficult to give meaningful contextual answers to people you don't know, 120 people over Zoom immediately. So we'll try to get what you can out of this. What do we mean when we talk about allyship? So all the facilitators had a call by Dr. Mays around allyship, and these were the six top points for how to be a good ally, or the practice orientation around allyship. And so understand your privilege, listen and do your homework, focus on those who share your identity, amplify, do not overshadow, realize you're going to make mistakes and apologize when you do, and remember that to be an ally is an action. So this is not a talk about allyship, but just to give you some basis by which to have this conversation about how that connects to community engagement. One thing I wanted to say is that these concepts of allyship, I think they're foundational to being able to engage in community work and to being able to be an effective organizer, in the sense that a lot of what you are trying to do in these practices of allyship and functions of that is to try to address the internalized oppressor. So, from the language of Paulo Freire, the internalized oppressor is the world that we live in, that's structured for the benefit of and by the people at the top, and then everyone has sort of that orientation and that sort of thought process kind of pushed into them as they grow up and then they're socialized. And so, to really address, to really be able to work with each other and not fall for this sort of divisive structures that we have inherited, there's a need to address that internalized oppressor, and a lot of what allyship is about that. And that brings us to a fundamental of community organizing, which is that all organizing is disorganizing and reorganizing again. So it's important to recognize that there isn't just like a blank page upon which you put your good idea, but there is like a way in which everything is set up, which has a purpose, whether it's useful or not. And that mode of thinking, that mode of behavior, that mode of acting has to be illuminated so that it can be challenged, so that it can be deconstructed, and then in its place, you can put, what it is that we want to see. And what we want to see in the Zapatistas of Mexico, we want to see a world where many worlds fit. So in my view, these concepts of allyship are about getting you to learn the practices necessary to be able to do that sort of thing, right? To be able to work for a world where many worlds fit, because that's not the received dominant culture wisdom, right? So a second point, and actually, let me just say one more thing on that. So just to try to make it a little bit more, a little less conceptual. So both my parents were, my mother was born in Mexico, my dad's first generation. My family is Mexican. We lived in El Paso. I have no misunderstandings about who I am, but I have light-skinned. And so in a professional environment, that means that enough of the time you can pass. And in school growing up and so on, because my mom's a doctor, and so we had a lot of class privilege. And so one thing that I learned in the white world is that that white people are totally comfortable without anyone else. Like the world is set up for them, and it works out. And by and large, if people of color disappeared, they wouldn't be mad, but they wouldn't necessarily miss us. They wouldn't even know. And so that's what I mean when I say a world where many worlds fit, where we're actually trying to have multiple points of view and not just like a dominant one that everyone is expected to connect into or try to emulate or be a part of. So individuals matter, but individual growth is insufficient. So in organizing, we do what are called one-to-one or relational meetings. And the whole goal of that is to try to understand what matters to somebody else, what moves them to act in this world, on what issues are they concerned about, but what are the things that they care about and the way that they express themselves. And the goal of that is to understand that about other people and also potentially share some of that about yourself, not in an intentional way for the purpose of finding ways where we might work together or ways where we might connect. Because what we recognize is that collective problems require collective solutions, right? So, but as individuals, as people, we actually need those relational bonds, those connections to each other, to form a collective identity that's meaningful to act on collective solutions, right? So it's through lots of one-on-one conversations, for instance, starting the Health Equity Circle. It's through lots of one-on-one intentional conversations with the leadership of other student groups, with faculty, with staff, that you start to understand what's going on in this place and what are the things that people want to see change, or the things that are important to them. And then you can start to pull people together to start to form a collective sense of the problem. Because in American culture, very frequently, we look at problems as individual, a problem that you need to address as an individual, or a problem of how you need to behave or act as an individual, or how you're going to solve it as an individual. And I would say medical culture, historically and still into the present, doesn't do a great job of separating people from that illusion that they need to solve it individually. And I think a lot of the process of getting into medical school privileges and encourages a individualist approach to addressing problems and understanding things. So the next point is that power matters. And for community engagement, power is essential. And I think when we say power, a lot of people get different interpretations. The idea of power makes some people uncomfortable, and for good reason. Power can be abused and has been abused many times. But what we are talking about when we're talking about power is very simply the ability to act, or in Spanish, poder, right? Poder is just the ability to act. It's not a positive or a negative. And so the reason why it's important, why power matters, is that it is not only because the right thing doesn't happen in this world because it's the right thing to do. It happens because people with power made it happen, or people with power were held accountable by others who were using their collective power to make something happen. So let me just give you an example. So the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This is a United Nations convention that was created and has hundreds of countries as signatories. And we don't have the chat on right now, but who would guess that the United States signed this? So I think many people would think the United States did not sign it. But in fact, the United States actually is a signatory to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And who thinks, when did they sign that? When did that show up? You know, it might surprise you to know that in 1968, the United States signed on to this International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And not only did they sign on to it in 1968, but they doubled down and reaffirmed their signatory status in 1995. What we know for certain is that we have not eliminated all forms of racial discrimination in the United States, and that in some ways there has been progress since 1968 or 1995, and in some ways there definitely has not. And so it is not just good intentions, meaningful words, high-minded ideals that matter, but it's actually the ability to act on those things. So one thing we say in organizing is that you have as much justice as you have the power to compel. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind in the current moment, when everyone from Coca-Cola to your medical school is declaring that they're an anti-racist institution. And a lot of very fine words are put to print, and all of those things are good, and all of those things embody a commitment to which those organizations can and should be held accountable. So it's a good thing to make these declarations, because then it's something that you've committed to, but then it's a question of organized engagement and power to make sure that commitment is made real, and that it's not just fine words on a page. That brings me to the iron rule of community organizing, which is never do for others what they can do for themselves. And what this gets at is really this concept of power with versus power over. So as future physicians, you are all going to have a lot of cultural clout, a lot of economic power, a lot of power and privilege in your position. And if we are honest, or if we are intentional about the way that we want to engage with communities, it needs to be with the community. It can't be coming in with all the right answers and providing them for people who have less, or have, that even though you may be an expert in disease and its treatment, that most people are experts in their life experience and their life situations, and that expertise needs to be combined with the knowledge that comes from professionals and technicians. So, one way to think about that is that professional expertise should be on tap and not on top, right? So you should be drawing from that skill and that knowledge which you're working so hard to learn when it's necessary and when it's useful, but that should not be driving the conversation. And so all of these practices of allyship that I mentioned at the very beginning are helpful with having more reflection, with having a better sense of yourself, your own privilege, your own position. And one thing I want to suggest is that, and as I said, I think allyship is fundamental, foundational, but that our goal has to move beyond allyship, which is oftentimes couched in a very individualist frame, where it's about like, here are the 10 things that you should do to be a better ally, or how do you need to act and behave. And those things are valuable insofar as individuals need to do the work for themselves, and they absolutely do. But it overlooks the collective aspect. So the way that I want to try to explain that is that, allies, oftentimes the goal is that they're looking at each other, trying to be supportive and understanding, but at some level there's an idea of fundamental separation, right? As my identity, I'm trying to help out in your identity, but there's like a barrier between us. And that's true to some extent, but as I said, all organizing is disorganizing and reorganizing again. And so when we talk about comrades, and this is not in the sense of communism, but the idea of comradeship, or being on the front lines together, is that comrades are looking outwards towards a shared struggle. So they've done the work individually to be able to develop a collective goal, and then they can take that collective goal and they can turn it outwards on how we're going to make that happen together. And so I have just like a that I like, that I think kind of embodies, going from as a Mexican American, I deserve this, to to trying to take I don't know what you'd say, like a more universal approach to it, or a more collective approach to it. So where is it? So this is from Eyes on the Prize. If you have not seen Eyes on the Prize, it's a expansive documentary on the civil rights movement, and really should be kind of a foundational, was made many years ago, but it just, in terms of the footage that it shows and the interviews they collected, it's just like a foundational document. So this is a little piece about the Woolworth boycott, around the boycotts of Woolworth and the lunch counters, etc.
And you may be paying for it for 3 months later.
Within 2 months, the sit-ins had spread to 69 cities, from Greensboro to San Antonio, and 2,000 had been arrested. To support the sit-in movement, a national boycott was organized. Those chain stores which discriminated in the South were also picketed in the North.
Do you think that the boycott has had any great impact on these national chains in a city like New York up to this time?
Well, I've already seen statements from some of the executive officers of both Crest and Woolworth indicating that they're concerned that the decline has already been noted and it's just beginning.
I take it then that you are advocating Negroes in New York to stay out of these national chain stores?
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm advocating that American citizens interested in democracy should stay out of chain stores.
So, the reason why I think that's a good example is because, one of the great successes of the civil rights movement was placing itself within and claiming American citizenship, claiming the values of America for itself. And so instead of saying, yes, of course, I'm encouraging all oppressed people to boycott Woolworths, it's putting forward a positive statement of, all people interested in democracy need to be engaged in this effort. And so, in a small way, I think that's a example of, taking a creation of a shared struggle and moving away from what is it's necessary for people to understand their own oppression and their own identities and groups, but then at some point that has to come back together to be most effective. And so in that video, you see that in terms of the national boycott that gets developed, and you see on the picket line, Black people and white people that have a shared collective effort. So there's, allyship and engagement there, and also the reorganizing of the problem from one affecting Black people to being a fundamental problem of democracy, and then this being an issue that invites and actually requires everyone's engagement to safeguard and maintain the country as a concept. So let me just close with this statement from James Baldwin, who said, oh, this is very in the way, who said, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the other, do not falter in our duty now. We may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. And so, I bring that up because this idea of achieving our country, this idea of pulling people towards a collective action is a fundamental part of successful community engagement, is starting from the belief that we have something together to accomplish, and that we all are needed to make that piece happen. So I don't know if I have any time left, but wanted to give a chance for people to voice their reactions or questions about that before you try to digest it in your small groups.